Hello, dear viewers. In this fourth part of our video review, we will continue to consider Russia's defeats in wars that it itself unleashed. In this series, we will touch upon such wars as the Soviet-Afghan War, the First and Second Chechen Wars, as well as the Russian-Georgian War. We will pay special attention to the defeat of the USSR in the Cold War, where we will show why it was unable to further develop and participate in the subsequent confrontation with the United States and the NATO bloc. We will learn about its industry, economy, and army. We will show how technical and economic backwardness contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And the military campaign of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan contributed to this, where the USSR unleashed a war and lost again. How did this happen? It's simple. In the West, the USSR ran into the NATO bloc. Therefore, expansion in these areas was impossible for it. In the South, it was also impossible. There was Turkey, a NATO member. The same situation developed in the Far East. There, the USSR bordered on Japan, Korea, and China. Japan was under the protectorate of the United States and was an ally of America. Korea, as a result of the global confrontation and the Korean War, was divided into North and South. There were also American military bases in South Korea. And China, like the USSR, was communist. Moreover, it was too large. And this would have led to a large-scale war. But what if the democratic countries of the world began to provide military assistance to China? Then it could have completely changed its political vector of movement and began to introduce capitalism and move closer to the North Atlantic Alliance NATO. The USSR could not allow this. Therefore, there was nowhere to expand in the East either. As a result, only Central Asia remained. That is where the Soviet Union turned its attention. In the 1970s, Afghanistan was engulfed in political instability. And apparently, this was not an accident. As a result, under various pretexts, the USSR began introducing troops into Afghanistan. Of course, the real goal was to gain complete control over this country, to create a communist pro-Soviet government there, and then, perhaps, to annex it to the USSR. During this period, Afghanistan was a predominantly agrarian country. It had almost no industry. Therefore, the Soviet troops managed to capture and occupy this country very easily. Afghanistan had a weak army, poorly equipped with weapons and equipment. Therefore, the USSR apparently thought that they would easily take control of this country. But they were wrong. Thus, starting in the summer of 1979, Soviet instructors, advisors, signalmen, etc. began to arrive in the country. They arrived there to support pro-Soviet political forces, in particular the pro-Soviet People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And already in December 1979, the official introduction of Soviet troops into Afghanistan began. Government buildings and institutions were immediately seized, and power in the country changed. The new pro-Soviet government declared the creation of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Most airfields accepted Soviet landings. They were followed by ground units that entered the country and not only took control of it, but actually occupied it. But the country's population and the political opposition did not accept such an occupation. They began to form forces of popular resistance, forces of the People's Militia against the invaders. In the same December, immediately after the introduction of Soviet troops, the number of armed forces of the People's Militia of Afghanistan amounted to at least 40,000 people. The first shots rang out, the first battles began. Thus began the Soviet-Afghan War. Western democratic countries, and the United States in particular, decided to support the Afghan people and the popular resistance forces. Thus began the supply of weapons and ammunition to the militia forces. It was these weapons that enabled the Afghan people to resist and wage war against the Soviet occupation. Thus, the attempt to quickly capture and occupy Afghanistan by the Soviet Union led to a long, multi-year war. The massive use of aviation and bombing initially caused great damage to Afghanistan and its popular resistance forces. But then the militia received American Stinger manpads. Soviet planes and helicopters began to fall one after another. The light armored vehicles of the USSR turned out to be unsuitable for war. Their guns could not rise higher to fire in mountain gorges. And the lack of armor could not protect against mines. As a result, Soviet soldiers were forced to move not inside armored vehicles, but to ride on top of them. In this way, they were at least somehow protected from being blown up by mines and land mines. But at the same time, they became defenseless against any enemy attacks. This led to an increase in Soviet losses. The difficult terrain and mountainous area created good conditions for defense, contributed to the guerrilla and sabotage war of the Afghan people. Soviet troops were ambushed, blown up by mines and explosive devices, and subjected to sudden attacks by the people's militia. All this led to massive losses among the Soviet troops. They could not take full control of the country, the people resisted the occupation. Despite the colossal superiority of the Soviet army over the Afghan resistance forces, the USSR was defeated. At first, the war dragged on for 10 long years. The West imposed sanctions against the USSR for aggression. The USSR economy began to fall apart. And the large losses of Soviet troops in Afghanistan made this war unpopular in the USSR. People were unhappy, they were against it. No one understood why this war was needed and why the Soviet Union was waging it. This also became one of the reasons for the collapse of the USSR in the future. The USSR tried in so many ways to seize Afghanistan. It carried out large-scale operations, tried to take control of the border with Pakistan and Iran, carried out missile and bomb strikes, etc. But nothing helped. The people were against the occupier, and the resistance forces supported by it continued the war against the aggressor. Western countries helped with weapons. A helicopter or plane could be shot down with a manpads. Minimal costs compared to the cost of the downed aircraft. And what was inside, or who was inside? The same situation with armored vehicles. There were also large military losses. Thus, the USSR's expenses on the war were enormous. Its economy could not withstand it. Political and international pressure grew. Sanctions brought down energy prices. Oil prices fell. The USSR lost large revenues from the sale of oil and gas abroad. All this fundamentally affected the USSR as a whole. The Soviet military could not take control of Afghanistan, but only received more and more losses from year to year. As a result, in 1988, the Soviet leadership decided to begin withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. The country was left in ruins. The losses were enormous on both sides. In February 1989, the USSR announced a complete withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. But this was not a withdrawal of troops, it was a real flight. Because the fighting continued as long as Soviet soldiers were on the territory of Afghanistan. They were not even allowed to leave peacefully, they were attacked even during retreat, during flight. And the picture, the film, which showed how the USSR was withdrawing its troops peacefully, moving across the bridge, it was a production. In reality, everything was quite the opposite. Soviet troops left, as a rule, with battles, ambushes, sabotage, and shelling. It was a real flight from the country. And the pro-Soviet government was later overthrown by the People's Militia of Afghanistan with the opposition. Thus, the USSR left Afghanistan without achieving any goals there. In fact, it was a major defeat. It was the effect of this defeat that led to the collapse of the USSR. The economy worsened. The moral blow from the defeat in Afghanistan increased anti-government sentiments. At least regarding the competence of the country's leadership. The USSR lagged far behind the West technically. Its industry could no longer produce modern goods. As an example, it is known from open sources that before the collapse of the USSR, its industry could no longer produce more than 80% of Western products. Products that were obtained and delivered to the USSR by Soviet intelligence. It turned out that the level of Soviet industry lagged so far behind the West that the USSR could no longer copy these products and could not produce them in its own factories. It could no longer produce even the simplest Western goods. But it was precisely copying Western products that Soviet industry had previously been engaged in. To clarify, it is imperative to clarify about the goods in the USSR. Almost all national economy goods produced by the Soviet industry were copies of Western models. the Soviet Union was constantly lagging behind the developed countries of the West. The USSR bought licenses to produce Western goods. Also, such goods were often simply copied. In fact, nothing of its own was created in the USSR. Therefore, almost all Soviet products were copies of Western products. Almost all cars, buses, motor transport, trucks, all of these were copies of Western cars. All consumer goods were also copies. But the West was developing factories and plants, and the USSR could not keep up with it. Sometimes the USSR signed contracts with some Western companies and they supplied it with equipment for the production of cars or any other products on the territory of the USSR. But this could not last long. The USSR was falling further and further behind the West. Moreover, the Cold War prohibited many types of supplies to the USSR. There was real isolation of the Soviet Union. There were sanctions. In such conditions, the USSR's lag behind the West increased sharply. It could no longer catch up with the developed countries. Consequently, the Soviet Union could no longer produce modern goods at that time. The same was true for the military sphere, military equipment, weapons. If the Soviet industry could not produce modern civilian products, then how could it produce modern military products? No way. It could not produce anything modern at all. The same was true for weapons and military equipment. The economy was ineffective. As a result, further confrontation with the West in the Cold War was doomed to another defeat. Therefore, in 1991, the USSR collapsed. To better understand how far the Soviet Union lagged behind the West, I suggest briefly examining several examples. Let us clarify right away that the USSR economy was also very inefficient. Labor productivity was approximately 1/3 of the level of Western countries. This is a critically low indicator. Only by this indicator could one say that the USSR would not be able to continue the confrontation, much less the arms race, with the United States and NATO. Such low labor productivity indicated that the country could not provide itself and its population with even basic consumer goods. And there is no talk of any luxury at all. It simply did not exist. Things even got to the point that the country began to have a deficit of literally everything that was possible. In fact, any goods were in short supply, the population could not buy them freely. Even if they had the money to buy them. People were forced to stand in long lines for products. There was not even enough food. Meat products were in short supply. A simple example. Here is a vivid example of the late USSR. This is the title this photo was given when it was recorded in history, I quote. "This is what happiness looked like when they brought in ram bones. They dumped them right in the middle of the street and were immediately taken apart. This is the city of Novokuznetsk, Russia, in 1988. That is, practically before the collapse of the USSR. Then what kind of Cold War and arms race with NATO could we even talk about? If the country had such a situation with the economy and food. The population was practically living on the brink of starvation. The only thing that probably saved people from starvation was that the USSR had a lot of arable fields and was an exporter of grain crops. Therefore, there was enough grain and therefore bread was always available. The same with cereals. But with everything else, there were big problems. That is, the country had big economic problems. And any war is, first of all, a war of economies. And here, judging by this photo, there was no hint of the economy. A completely incomprehensible, total, ineffective economic anarchy instead of an economy. As a result, there was a deficit of literally everything. The population of the Soviet Union lived in conditions of a total deficit of food and consumer goods. Clothes were in short supply. There was a shortage of shoes. Instead of buying new shoes, people constantly repaired old ones. Buying a car was almost impossible. Buying household appliances was very difficult, and even then, you had to wait a long time to get them somewhere on the market. Naturally, such a system brought itself to collapse. There was no other way. What can we say if there was not even toilet paper in the country? It was also in great shortage. And this in a country that had the largest forest areas in the world. and accordingly had the largest reserves of wood. And they could not produce paper in the required quantities. What more complicated could we talk about then? Of course, such an ineffective system was doomed to degradation and collapse. An attempt to rebuild the system also ended in failure. So, the Soviet Empire collapsed. As a result, some nations gained freedom and independence, while others suffered a moral blow from the collapse of the USSR. First of all, this is the Russian people. In fact, the loss in the Cold War gave rise to defeat complexes and a desire for revenge. Soon, this desire will become one of the reasons for new wars unleashed by Russia. If we compare it with an analogy in history, it is similar to the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War. Germany lost, and at first there was disappointment in society, and then there was a desire for revenge. As is known, this became one of the reasons for the outbreak of the Second World War. For Russia, the Treaty of Versailles was a loss in the Cold War, which resulted in the collapse of the USSR. It could not withstand it and fell apart. Thus, the mood in society and the readiness for war led to new wars and conflicts. And soon, all this will result in a full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war, which will be the largest military conflict since the end of the Second World War. But this will happen later, and for now, in 1994, a new local war broke out on the territory of the Russian Federation, the Chechen War. After the collapse of the USSR, many nations gained freedom and became independent. These are those that were not part of the Russian Federal Soviet Republic, but were separate republics under the USSR. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federal Soviet Republic began to be called the RF or Russia. It also consisted of separate republics, separate nationalities. And many of them also wanted freedom and independence. For example, the Chechen Republic. So, even before the collapse of the USSR, in 1990, nationalist movements in the Chechen Republic grew stronger, and the All-National Congress of the Chechen People was created. Its goal was Chechnya's secession from the USSR and the creation of an independent Chechen Republic. Just before the collapse of the USSR in July 1991, the Chechen Congress declared Chechnya's secession from the USSR. It must be said that this was facilitated by the mood in many republics of the USSR, which was about to collapse. And in August 1991, it did collapse. The republics gained independence. But Chechnya did not. Since it was not part of the USSR, but of the Russian Federation. The Chechen people supported the National Congress, which declared Chechnya's independence. So, the Russian Federation was faced with the fact that Chechnya had left its territory. And it could do nothing about it. Because the national movement was supported by the Chechen people. It was headed by Dzokhar Dudayev, a former general of the Soviet Army. On October 27, 1991, presidential elections were held in Chechnya, and Dzokhar Dudayev won with 90.1% of the votes. On November 1, his first decree declared the independence of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. In November 1991, Russian President Boris Yeltsin declared a state of emergency in Chechnya. But the Chechen People's Militia took everything under control. The state of emergency was lifted. At that time, Russia was still very weak. And weak, first of all, economically. The USSR had just collapsed, and the war in Afghanistan had recently ended. The country was heavily dependent on the West. Russia was under threat of famine. It was necessary to establish food imports from foreign countries. In general, there was no time for war. Therefore, from 1991 to 1994, the Chechen Republic was actually an independent country. Russian troops and police left the republic. It was formed as an independent state, although it was not recognized by anyone in the world. But in fact, it remained so. And most importantly, the new government had the total support of the local population. But since 1994, Russia has decided to resume its expansion. And the first target, of course, was Chechnya, which had defended its freedom and independence. Because Chechnya's exit from the Russian Federation could show other Russian republics that they could also leave if they wanted. The Russian Federation could not allow this. In December 1994, the bombing of airfields and military bases in Chechnya began. At the same time, the introduction of Russian troops into Chechnya began. The first clashes and battles with local armed forces began. This is how the First Chechen War began. Chechnya is not large in territory and population. The Russian army had a huge advantage in the number of soldiers, weapons, and equipment. But it lost. It was unable to take control of the entire republic. In fact, it was a people's war against the occupier. Guerrilla actions, sabotage and ambushes were widespread. Russia began to suffer serious losses, and the war itself and the constant Russian bombing destroyed Chechnya. As a result, on June 10, 1996, peace agreements were signed, according to which Russian troops were to be completely withdrawn from Chechnya. But this did not happen. Russia violated its obligations. It did not want to withdraw its troops. Therefore, the People's Militia was forced to continue fighting for its freedom and independence. As a result, the hostilities continued. And only then did the Russian government apparently understand that without the withdrawal of Russian troops, this war could not be stopped. At the same time, in early August, Chechen militias attacked the Russian army in several large cities. The Russian army was defeated. The militia took control of the central part and government buildings of the largest city of Grozny and took full control of a number of other populated areas. It was these defeats of the Russian army that became the main reason for signing the Khasavyurt agreement on a ceasefire. Russia started and lost this military campaign. Although the Russian army was orders of magnitude superior in numbers and equipment to the Chechen forces of popular resistance. In fact, this was a people's liberation war of the Chechen people against the Russian aggressor-occupier. Russia realized that the Russian army was very poorly organized and had low combat effectiveness. It was not ready to seize even small Chechnya. Therefore, the Russian leadership decided to freeze this war. The peace agreement stipulated that Russian troops would be completely withdrawn from Chechnya, and the decision on the republic's status was postponed until December 31, 2001. In this way, the Russian Federation reserved for itself the possibility of starting a future war. But it began earlier, in 1999. Moreover, in Russia they were unable to call it a war. They began to call it a counter-terrorist operation, as well as a military operation, etc. Although it was an even larger war than the first military campaign. Thus, on August 7, 1999, under various pretexts, Russia again began military operations against Chechnya. Having a huge superiority in the number of soldiers, weapons, and military equipment, the Russian army was able to occupy most of the territories and settlements of the republic. What they could not take by force, they destroyed with concentrated artillery and air strikes. The introduced military contingent was many times greater than the local resistance. Thus, Russia managed to achieve control over the territory of Chechnya, but guerrilla warfare, sabotage, ambushes, and surprise attacks continued for many years. Russia simply filled all of Chechnya with its troops. Then, gradually, the troops began to be withdrawn. Control of the republic passed first to the Federal Security Service, and then to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. In this war, Russia again suffered heavy losses and also received strong condemnation in the world. Political pressure grew. As a result, Russia was forced to cancel the counter-terrorist operation in Chechnya. Its completion was declared only on April 16, 2009. That is, in fact, this full-scale war between Russia and Chechnya lasted almost 10 years. During this time, it had an active combat phase of a full-scale war and then a phase of rebel war. The war was over, but the population was critical of Russia. A new war would not be long in coming. Russia could not allow this. And in order to gain long-term control over the destroyed republic, Russia decided to buy the loyalty of the Chechen population. So huge federal funds began to flow into Chechnya, destroyed cities, villages, infrastructure, etc. began to be rebuilt. Everything was done to raise the standard of living of the population. In fact, this can be regarded as Russia paying reparations for the war. And also, as investments to postpone its beginning in the future as much as possible. And maybe even prevent it altogether. The Russian government began to allocate, quote, for the maintenance of the people of Chechnya 300 billion rubles per year. These are the figures that were announced in 2022. Thus, we can say that in fact, for many years Russia could not take control of the population and rebels of the small Chechen Republic and decided to bribe them. It began to pay huge amounts of money to the Chechen population for their loyalty. In fact, it was a ransom. This means that the Russian Federation shamefully lost this war and was forced to bribe the local population in an attempt to stop their rebel war against the Russian occupation. And for the population, it was also better to receive high incomes than to fight again, have losses and be in destruction. At the same time, Russia understood that as soon as they stopped allocating large sums of money for the maintenance of Chechnya, it could immediately rise again. This means that the issue with Chechnya remains unresolved. And reparations continue to be paid. A simple example, as it became known in the media at the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025, Russia decided to allocate 15 times more funds for the maintenance of Chechnya in 2025 than, for example, for the Kursk region. It is noteworthy that the Russian campaign in Ukraine led to the Ukrainian army launching an offensive on Kursk in 2024. As a result, huge territories of Russia were captured. By August 15, 2024, Ukraine captured about 1,000 square kilometers, which is more than the territory of Ukraine captured by Russia during the entire 2023. In the Kursk region in 2024, there were some of the most intense battles in the Russian-Ukrainian War. The Russian army could not displace the armed forces of Ukraine from this region, and for this it needed a large North Korean army. Russia could not cope alone. Therefore, it began to widely use the help of the DPRK army. There were massive air raids, artillery and missile attacks, a massive drone war, and finally, the now familiar to Russia, bloody assaults by its infantry. The territory was in severe destruction. Plus, in the Russian-Ukrainian War, the Kursk region was constantly under retaliatory shelling by the Ukrainian army. Because it is a frontline region. It's simple. Russia bombed Ukraine from the Kursk region, and Ukraine responded in response. Thus, the region suffered great destruction, and most of the population was evacuated. At the same time, the Kursk region is much larger in size than Chechnya. And the population is also significantly larger. And in these conditions, Russia decided to allocate 15 times more funds to Chechnya than to support the Kursk region. What is this, if not reparations payments to Chechnya from Russia? It turns out that Russia is really afraid that if payments are reduced, Chechnya will rise up again and demand independence. And to prevent this from happening, Russia continued to allocate huge funds to the Chechen people. Probably no other region of Russia, with the same size as Chechnya, receives even close to the amount of funds that Chechnya receives. This means that the war is not over, it is only in a temporary truce, while Russia pays tribute to the Chechen people for loyalty and peace. However, how long will this continue? And how long will Russia be able to pay Chechnya such funds, such reparations? And what will happen if such payments are refused? History will show. But before the war in Chechnya had even ended, Russia had started a new war, this time again in the Caucasus. Georgia found itself at the center of events. After the collapse of the USSR, Russia decided to retain control over its former border territories. The most distant republics were to remain under Moscow's control. But how could this be achieved, given that the countries were demanding independence? After all, they could later distance themselves from Russia and join other political associations and unions. That is, escape Russian control. To prevent this, individual military conflicts were created on the territory of these distant republics. Then they were frozen. And everywhere, Russian troops acted as guarantors of stability. This was the case in Azerbaijan and Armenia, where the military and territorial conflict began during the USSR. And after its collapse, Russia established its military bases there. The countries were small, so they had small armies. They could not resist the larger Russian army. Therefore, they were forced to agree to freeze the war and the conflict. As a rule, in such conflicts, one of the parties occupied part of the territory of the other party. Then, with the participation of Russia, this conflict was frozen. And one of the parties considered part of its territories occupied. Another one, having received new territories, also could not join other political unions. Because it had a territorial dispute and a frozen conflict. Therefore, such countries could not escape Russia's influence and join another political union or organization. Especially when Russia could easily provoke a resumption of the conflict and hostilities. Such countries found themselves on a short leash of the Kremlin. It was exactly the same in Moldova, where part of its territories in Transnistria, controlled by Moscow, declared independence. But Moldova could not restore its territorial integrity, because Russian military bases were located on the territory of Transnistria. And this threatened a war with Russia. So, Moldova could not leave Russia and join, for example, the European Union, even if the majority of the Moldovan population wanted it. The country was dependent on a frozen conflict with Russia's participation. And later, the Russian Federation had plans to annex Transnistria to the Russian Federation. This was supposed to happen after Russia occupied the entire south of Ukraine, at least. But all these plans failed due to Russia's defeat in the Russian-Ukrainian War. After all, it did not achieve any of its main goals. Now let's get back to Georgia. The same situation has developed in Georgia. Part of the territories, namely Abkhazia and South Ossetia, with the support of the Kremlin, declared their alleged independence. This also happened back in the USSR in 1989. But Moscow did not annex them to the Russian Federation. Because, if they had annexed them, the rest of Georgia would have become free and could have joined the EU, for example. Therefore, in order to prevent this, these unrecognized formations remained Georgian territory, but in fact, they were controlled by Moscow. Russia wanted such republics to become autonomous within Georgia and to have the right of veto on foreign policy decisions of the country as a whole. That is, through these republics, Russia wanted to control the foreign policy of entire countries. But Georgia did not want this. The Georgian people wanted to determine their own development. As a result, such unrecognized territories remained neither Russian nor Georgian. According to international law, they were Georgian, but de facto they were completely controlled and managed by Moscow. As a result, these were regions that fell under international sanctions, and no one wanted to conduct any economic activity there, much less invest there. Thus, such unrecognized entities became real outcasts. Therefore, Abkhazia and South Ossetia were not needed by Russia itself. It used them, just like most similar territories in other similar frozen conflicts. At the same time, Georgia could not give up its territories. Thus, it remained a hostage of the Kremlin. And so, pro-Western President Mikhail Saakashvili came to power in Georgia. He almost completely withdrew the country from Russian influence, carried out important economic and social reforms, and announced Georgia's intention to join the European Union. In 2006, he signed an agreement on the withdrawal of Russian troops from Georgian territory. This concerned military bases in the unrecognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The withdrawal of Russian troops was to be completed in 2008. Russia, under international law, was obliged to sign and fulfill these demands of Georgia, which it did ahead of schedule in 2007. Then, in 2008, in the border areas of South Ossetia, there were provocations with shelling of several villages and peacekeeping forces of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was formed after the collapse of the USSR. On August 8, 2008, Georgia sent military and police to restore order in these regions. On the same day, Russia began introducing troops into Georgia, allegedly to protect the population of South Ossetia, where there were many Russians. The military clashes led to the outbreak of war. Russia then began bombing Georgia and a full-scale Russian invasion began. It must be said that most likely the president of Georgia wanted to introduce troops into South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and then establish de facto control over them by Georgia. But he did not calculate that the Russian Federation would start shooting and using this as a pretext to introduce the Russian army into Georgia, to re-establish control over the country and continue the frozen conflict. At the same time, we can say that Russia was expecting such a step and was preparing for it. Russia needed a precedent, and it appeared with the introduction of Georgian troops. It is clear that Russia did not want to lose control over Georgia. And even more so, Russia did not want Georgia to leave Russia and join the EU. This means that the real goal of the war of the Russian Federation against Georgia is to capture Georgia completely or establish its control over it. Later it became known that on August 10, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov told U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice that the democratically elected president of Georgia Saakashvili must leave. That is, in this way Russia wanted to achieve a change of power in Georgia in order to prevent its movement towards the European Union. This was the main goal. In this regard, it can be considered that Russia's invasion of Georgia failed, because President Mikhail Saakashvili remained in power after the war, and Russian troops were unable to capture and occupy Georgia. They did not reach the capital Tbilisi and did not risk capturing it. And the Georgian army was already preparing the city for defense. In addition, Russian aviation could not operate freely because Ukraine had previously delivered modernized Buk air defense systems to Georgia, as well as a number of other air defense systems. As a result, several Russian fighters and bombers were shot down. It became clear that Georgia retained control of the skies. However, the Russian army still carried out massive artillery and missile and bomb strikes on Georgian cities and villages. They were heavily destroyed. Also, cluster munitions caused heavy losses among the civilian population. But the Georgian army held the defense and inflicted heavy losses on the Russian invaders. At the same time, the real ratio of losses of the Russian army to the Georgian army was 12 to 14 to 1. That is, the Russian army suffered colossal losses. It took numbers, not skill. In fact, it has already become accustomed to it, with bloody assaults. Hence such losses. Naturally, with such losses, there was no talk of capturing the capital Tbilisi. The losses would have been many times higher. Also, the mountainous regions of Georgia contributed to the defense of the Georgian army. Plus, the international community declared that it would not allow the occupation of the country. The consequences for the Russian Federation would be serious. Sanctions would be introduced. Then American frigates with Tomahawk missiles on board entered the Black Sea. Panic began in the Kremlin. As a result, a decision was made to leave Georgia and withdraw troops. More precisely, the peace treaty of August 12 stated that the troops of Georgia and Russia should be withdrawn to their pre-war positions and deployment sites. It was also stated that the decision on the future status of the unrecognized territories would be decided exclusively by diplomatic means. Thus, the main goals of the Russian Federation in this war were completely failed. Russia failed to seize and occupy it, change the political leadership or gain control over the country. At the same time, Georgia also failed to achieve its goals. It failed to gain control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia. However, Georgia still remained free and had every opportunity to move further into the EU. A similar situation happened with Ukraine. The country chose its development vector and decided to join the European Union. This will be the starting point for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that is how the Russian-Ukrainian War will begin, first as a local hybrid one, and then a full-scale one. It will be the largest war since the end of World War II. But it will not be the only one. There will be a number of other wars in which Russia will also lose, including because of a full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war. We will talk about these wars in detail in our next fifth part of the video review. And that's all I have for now. Special thanks from the author to everyone who helps the channel. Your help is very important. Like, write comments and subscribe to the channel, where many more interesting videos await you. Thanks for watching. And see you soon with new videos. Peace and goodness to all.